If you ask most people, the value of a country might sound straightforward. Add up its GDP, subtract its debt, and you have a number. Maybe throw in some natural resources, some infrastructure, and a population count, and voila, a price tag on a nation. But that's the fairy tale. The real story of a country's worth is far stranger, far more human, and far more complex than any spreadsheet could capture. Because a country is not just a collection of money, land, and factories. A country is trust, its relationships, its knowledge, culture, and the invisible networks that hold it together. Its worth is woven from the same threads that made the first global financial networks thrive centuries ago: loyalty, reputation, and influence. The raw materials beneath the soil, cobalt, diamonds, coltan, are worth billions, but the land's real value is inseparable from who can enforce contracts, secure extraction, and protect the workforce. Yet land alone tells us almost nothing about a country's worth. Which brings us to another component: natural resources. Oil, gas, gold, timber. These are tangible, easy to price, and deceptively simple. But history teaches us that raw resources can be a curse. Venezuela's oil, Nigeria's oil, the Democratic Republic of Congo as minerals, all examples of immense natural wealth paired with political instability, corruption, or civil conflict. The physical resource is valuable, but without governance, social cohesion, and networks of trust, much of that wealth cannot be converted into long-term national worth. The resource curse, as economists call it, is a reminder that value is not intrinsic. It flows from human systems built around it. A railway without trained operators, a port without merchants. A dam without engineers is a pile of metal and concrete, not national wealth. Human capital, skilled, connected, and adaptable people, is the real engine. Nations like South Korea, Japan, and Switzerland have leveraged comparatively limited natural resources into extraordinary national worth by investing in education, health, and technical expertise. Knowledge, in other words, can outweigh land, mineral, or even military power. And then there's governance. The systems a country uses to make decisions, enforce laws, and manage disputes are like the operating system of a computer. If the code is buggy, nothing works. No matter how powerful the hardware, well-governed nations can extract more value from every acre, every mineral deposit, and every human brain. Poorly governed nations may squander far more than they possess. Consider Singapore's meteoric rise in the 20th century. It has virtually no natural resources, but excellent governance turned it into one of the richest countries per capita in the world. Meanwhile, Zimbabwe's collapse under Robert Mugabe demonstrates how governance, or the lack of it, can dramatically reduce a country's practical worth. Debt is often cited as a factor in a country's value. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 200%. Yet it borrows at near-zero interest rates because lenders trust the system, the institutions, and the population. Conversely, a smaller debt load in a weakly governed or unstable country can be far more dangerous. Debt is a lens into a country's credibility and its networks of trust, not a standalone valuation metric. All of this brings us to something more abstract: The idea of national networks, like the medieval merchants, Jesuits, or Rothschilds described in other contexts. The real worth of a country often flows through invisible lines. Trade agreements, diplomatic alliances, intelligence sharing. International organizations, these are the conduits through which wealth, influence, and stability circulate. The United States network value during the 20th century, for example, far exceeded its GDP alone because of its alliances, military bases, and global influence. Similarly, Switzerland's neutrality, trust in its legal system, and banking networks create enormous intangible value that isn't captured by land, resources, or even people. History also reminds us that countries are like layered organisms. Their value is multidimensional. Military strength can create leverage, but it is rarely sufficient. Economic influence can shape the world, but only if it is credible. Cultural capital, art, science, language can build soft power that translates into economic and political advantage. China, for instance, has invested heavily in Belt and Road Initiative projects, not only to trade, but to build long-term influence, shaping perceptions of its national worth across continents. A nation's worth is therefore a composite of tangible and intangible assets, tangible and invisible leverage. Let's try to anchor these ideas with some historical perspective. In the 16th century, Spain seemed unstoppable. Its treasure fleets brought gold and silver from the Americas. Its territory stretched across continents, and it could field armies that terrified Europe. By some measures, Spain's national worth was astronomical. Yet by the 17th century, mismanagement, inflation, and war left the empire weakened. Land and resources alone had not preserved its value. Compare that to the Dutch Republic, smaller and less research, but with exceptional trade networks, financial systems, and mercantile expertise. The Netherlands' worth was in its networks and its operational efficiency, a reminder that wealth is not just about what you own, but how you mobilize it. In the modern era, think about oil-rich nations that lack strong institutions. Iraq in the late 20th century, Libya after Gaddafi, or Venezuela today. Despite enormous natural wealth, their practical national worth has been eroded by conflict, corruption, and the inability to convert resources into stable societal wealth. Meanwhile, countries with little in the way of raw resources, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, have created immense national value through innovation, networks, and strategic governance. This is why you can just tally assets and debts and declare a country's worth. Value is relational, dynamic, and human. Which brings us to the ultimate question. Can we quantify a country's real worth? Economists have tried. GDP measures output, GNP attempts to account for income flows, Human Development Index adds health and education. Sovereign wealth funds track financial assets. But all of these miss the underlying networks, the trust, the culture, the strategic relationships that ultimately allow a country to generate, protect, and grow its wealth. A nation with $10 trillion in GDP but collapsing institutions may be worth far less than a $1 trillion GDP country with robust systems and global networks. The Rothschilds' model of networked finance centuries ago offers a useful analogy. Just as the Rothschilds synchronized operations across Europe, leveraged information, and built trust-based systems. Countries create macro networks through diplomacy, trade, alliances, and cultural influence. A country's worth is less about the sum of its physical parts, and more about the efficiency, reliability, and reach of these networks. And like the private networks of old, the most powerful aspects of a country's value are often invisible, unseen by the public. Hidden in intergovernmental communications, trade negotiations, and strategic planning, even today, we see evidence of this hidden value in crises. During the 2008 financial meltdown, some nations weathered the storm far better than others, not merely because of their GDP, but because of the strength of their institutional and global networks. Germany's response, underpinned by disciplined finance and EU coordination, preserved far more value than its raw economic output would suggest. Similarly, countries like Norway, with strong governance, clear rules for oil revenue management, and transparent institutions, demonstrate that national worth is as much about foresight and coordination as it is about resources. And yet, like the financial networks of the past, networks can also be fragile. Alliances shift, reputations falter, and trust erodes. A country may appear powerful, but if networks break, trade collapses. Diplomatic ties fail. Internal cohesion weakens, the perceived worth can plummet overnight. History is full of examples: the fall of the Roman Empire, the collapse of the Soviet Union, or more recently, rapid economic collapses in countries like Argentina. These moments illustrate that national value is not static. It is maintained, reinforced, and sometimes rebuilt through relationships, trust, and strategic coordination. So how much is a country really worth? The answer is that there is no single number. A country's worth is a complex ecosystem, the sum of its land, resources, infrastructure, population, governance, financial systems, strategic alliances, and cultural capital, all amplified or diminished by trust and networks. It is both tangible and intangible, visible and hidden. Just like the hidden networks of medieval finance, much of a country's real value operates in the shadows, in diplomacy, in intelligence, in the enforcement of law and custom, in the subtle reputation it carries abroad. Consider this thought experiment. Imagine two nations. One has fertile land, oil, and a large population, but corrupt institutions and fragile alliances. The other is small. If you had to buy one nation in today's global economy, the second is likely more valuable. Its systems, networks, and credibility translate into resilience and the ability to generate wealth far more than raw assets ever could. In fact, this networked view of national value can explain why some countries punch above their weight on the global stage. Switzerland, Singapore, Israel, and the Nordic nations consistently wield influence far beyond their population or land area. They leverage intelligence, governance, trade, alliances, and reputation to convert limited tangible resources into outsized national worth. In contrast, countries with abundant resources but weak networks, much of sub-Saharan Africa, parts of the Middle East, or post-Soviet states, often fail to fully capture the value beneath their feet. And just as private networks historically reinforce trust, modern networks amplify a country's value. International institutions, multilateral trade agreements, technology partnerships, and even informal diplomatic ties act as conduits of wealth and influence. A country's ability to navigate these networks to signal reliability, enforce agreements, and coordinate action determines how much of its potential translates into actual power and security. In this sense, national worth is as much about perception and reputation as it is about GDP or natural resources. At the end of the day, the lesson is clear. A country is more than its buildings, minerals, or currency. Its real worth lies in the invisible architecture of trust, knowledge, networks, and coordination. Like the medieval financial dynasties, the Jesuits, or the Rothschilds, nations thrive when they can synchronize, mobilize, and leverage their human and material assets efficiently. And just as with those early networks, much of this value operates out of sight, behind closed doors, in quiet diplomacy, in the steady hum of governance, and in the credibility a nation earns over centuries. So next time you hear someone quote a GDP figure or a debt ratio as if it tells the whole story, remember, numbers are only a starting point. The real story is human, relational, and networked. The real worth of a country is the sum of its people, institutions, trust, knowledge, and the webs that connect them, a complex, evolving system that no spreadsheet can fully capture. Global finance, trade, and diplomacy may have evolved, but the principle remains. Value flows where trust flows, networks amplify potential, and information shapes outcomes. And in a world of crises, competition, and complexity, those countries that master networks, both visible and invisible, will consistently outperform those that rely solely on raw resources or rigid institutions. In the end, a country's true worth is a story, centuries in the making, built on human ingenuity, resilience, and the invisible threads that bind societies together. And while we may never assign it a precise dollar figure, understanding its foundations allows us to see which nations are truly powerful, resilient, and valuable, and which may be illusions waiting to collapse. Because if history has taught us anything, it's this: wealth, power, and influence are never just about what you hold. They're about who you trust, how you connect, and the networks you build. And the countries that understand this lesson are the ones that endure quietly, steadily, and often invisibly shaping the future of the world.